Well, hello, and a very warm welcome to the Applied Linguistics Association of Australia 2020 Christopher N. Candlin Memorial Lecture. Beside me is Michelle Kohler, and she's Vice President and President-elect of the Applied Linguistics Association of Australia. And my name's Jonathan Crichton, and I'm the President of ALAA. And today we are delighted to be able to introduce our invited speaker, Professor Joseph Lowe Bianco, known to most of us as Joe Lowe. And I'm not going to interrupt proceedings with a biographical introduction. If you're here listening, you know why. And so, without further ado, I would like to hand over to Joe for the Applied Linguistics Association of Australia 2020 Chris Candlin Memorial Lecture. Thank you so much, Joe. We all very much appreciate your doing this year for us.
Thank you, Jonathan and Michelle, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone who's participating. It's a really enormous honor to have been asked to give the Christopher Candlin Memorial Lecture in 2020. And so I will make some comments about Chris as I proceed, but I should begin by saying that I'm speaking from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I want to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge the ancestors. So my talk today, as you can see from the title on the first slide, is to pose the question of what kind of political community applied linguists are in the context of what kind of political activity we engage in, and what other kinds of language problems that we aim to solve and address. There'll be an extended version of the PowerPoint presentation as an elaborated academic paper on the ALAA website for people to access later on, because I'll only be able to cover a very small part of some areas of the theory of policy influence that I'm going to be talking about very briefly on the slides. So with those words, I'd like to start now the presentation. So as you can see here, I'm claiming that applied linguistics is really a kind of French language innovation in Australia. I don't mean that fully seriously. What I mean is that out of work that Tim McNamara mostly and I did, and which we published in 2001 in the Festschrift for Professor Bernard Spolsky, we looked into the origins of applied linguistics in Australia. And one of the things that emerges from this research, mainly conducted through interviews, was how really different it is actually from how applied linguistics got going in the United Kingdom and in the United States. As you can see on the slide, the origins of applied linguistics in Australia are from the activity of certain scholars, and in particular, Wilga Rivers and Terry Quinn, in language laboratory workshops, mostly at the University of Melbourne and mostly originally in French. Whereas applied linguistics in the UK comes out of Edinburgh and the efforts that, the University of Edinburgh, I mean, and the efforts that were located there, partly through the British Council, partly through the decolonisation process of the British state at the time in Asia and Africa, and partly through the emergence of an industry of teaching English as a foreign language. So all of it externally oriented and all of it located within English. Whereas in Australia, it grew out of tertiary modern languages, originally with the audiolingual obsession of the period, audiolingualism, the dominant methodology for the teaching of second languages, or the theory behind that dominant methodology at the time, and the experimentation around language labs and the science, in inverted commas, or or such as it was, around how languages would be acquired. In the US, very similar kind of history to the British one, but not connected directly to decolonization processes, mainly to the instruction, intensive instruction of teachers of English to foreigners and new immigrants. So you can see the roots of the associations are different. It's very interesting when we track through the international home organization that we all share, to the associations in Pakistan and other parts of the world, that English language teaching and the preparation of teachers and research directed to this is also commonly experienced as the genesis of a lot of these associations. And a very interesting thing is said in many of the statements about the creation of applied linguistics associations, which is to do with the wording you can see at the bottom of this slide. That is the real world grounding of the work. So I'm going to return to some of these points a bit later on. Of course, all our associations have gone massively beyond these origins and deal with language questions much, much more widely conceived than this. Chris Candlin is the spirit and inspiration for much of the work that we do. He trained many of the people who will be listening today, I assume, and others work in institutions where his influence has been immense. I want to just cite very quickly two obituaries written in his honor, one by Mike Breen, who collaborated very, very early in radical work that he and Chris did together about innovative language pedagogy, really transformative ideas, and Tim McNamara's tribute, which was read at Chris's funeral. You can see here that people say very remarkable things about him, all of which I can attest from my own experience are true. Mike Breen's point that the novice practitioner today enters a field of activity wherein its reach and focus have been extended and enriched by his theoretical insights, his collaborative research, and his teaching. The one that I like most is that Chris's work is a personal epistemology of language, grounded in an attentiveness to the well-being of others. That's deeply true and profound because of the extraordinary work that Chris and others did, Sally Candlin and others did, and initiated really in doctor-patient communication. Many things have emerged and expanded from that. And his astoundingly important work at Macquarie University when he and Sally moved to Australia as Professor of Linguistics when I first met him, and where we had, and I recall a conversation in which he asked me, or I volunteered, that my favorite word in English is kakistocracy. And I'm going to just leave that there now and get back to it on my final slide. And if you don't know what a kakistocracy is, you might have time to look it up on your handheld device before I get to it, but I'd prefer it if you didn't. So for Chris, the analysis of discourse, and this is deeply present in the point I made a moment ago about the real world repercussions and consequences of the work of applied linguistics, is about asymmetrical power relations in social and professional contexts. In other words, the purpose of the work isn't just scholarship, revealing through scholarship, although that's immensely worthwhile. I'm not in any way challenging that or implying any limitation to it, but it has an additional purpose. The refinement of theory, at which he was a master, is deeply about practical, real-world improvements for people. I say there too that one of the most, when anyone ever mentions Chris's name to me, one of the things that comes to my mind is the fact that I've never met anyone in my life, or even heard of anyone in my who can do what he often did, would be to get off a plane after an extremely long trip, go to a long and tedious meeting, and just when you thought he might be so tired he would fall asleep, used to do these micro sleeps and then staggeringly snap back with razor sharp focus into conversation, almost finishing other people's sentences. So sometimes when I drive along the highway and I see those signs that say a micro sleep, stop by the side of the road, it'll refresh you, I think of him immediately. In Tim's obituary, there's some wonderful statements in his honor from luminaries in our field, Claire Cramshley, Way, and others as well. So this term, the real world, is very present in the discussions of what applied linguistics associations exist for. I've got two definitions here, and to me these are ample. I've used them a couple of times. Applied linguistics, according to Alan Davis, 1999, is a coherent and distinctive academic discipline not dependent on formal linguistics. And in Christopher Brumfitt's 1995 definition, around which an entire issue of the journal Applied Linguistics was published some years back, he states the theoretical and empirical investigation of real-world problems in which language is a central issue. I find both of these really compelling because all of the propositional elements that constitute what I understand applied linguistics to be, and when people tell me about their work, or I supervise students who do work in this area, or I read journals, or my colleagues in ALAA or attend the American Association of Applied Linguistics, or in whatever other environment in which this domain frames our reason for being together, I think all of these propositional items are present and very real and accounting for it. So I think this is best described as a kind of praxis, and the link in the obituaries by both Mike and Tim between knowledge and action, theorized and informed, and therefore practice, reflected knowledge, is deeply present not only in Chris's work, but in our trajectory as an organization. And it's going to be very much present in my talk, which is about the political community. On my last slide, I've got a little capitulation trick. I don't mean surrender trick, but I'll see if you work out what I'm trying to say there. So the real world is often contrasted to this world, or to these worlds imagined in these images. That is, places of study, usually assumed to be universities, of course, removed from reality, removed from the consequences of the work that people do, shining places where people live comfortable lives. The definition of the ivory tower that I've just shown you is reflected here, and it's contrasted with these two images, the woman rolling up her sleeves, the guy doing some farming and getting his hands dirty. And they're more like the blue skies image of a contemplative philosopher. Now, this idea actually is not new, of course, and it's not just a criticism of universities and university life in our society. It's also in many ways unjust and incorrect, but it is actually powerfully present in the way people think about universities. And I think we've seen some recent reforms in higher education funding in Australia premised slightly on some of these prejudices. So I'm going to assume that we definitely are deeply present in the real world. We are people who honor the definitions by Davis and Brumfitt, and that the kind of real world problems that we talk about are the ones that are constituted by language, characterized a lot by language, or are accessible through language. In other words, language doesn't have to have the same presence in all of the problems, or doesn't have the same prominence in them either. It just needs to be present so that the insights that we might draw from formal linguistics or from sociology, from philosophy, from economics, from whichever, cultural studies, from Indonesian society, from social life in Germany, whatever the particular configuration of things that we draw on, should have a presence of about language and around language. In the abstract for this lecture and in my original thinking, I want to talk to you as my colleagues, as I say here, and our future as a community of scholars who do related, similar cognate work. I want to make sure in this talk that I'm not just exploring ideas, but also advocating and making suggestions. So I'm going to do it right away. One of my aims here is to lob a request right in the center of our profession. And it is that we massively upgrade our commitment to an idea and a set of language to use around the problems of language. It's already strongly implied in our work, in our public presence, in the choices we make, and in ways that I observe how applied linguists already imagine their place, their talking in the world, their professional conversation. And this idea is also present in our interactions with the non-specialist community, with government and public officials. I'm going to intersperse this idea, which I'm going to call linguistic justice and linguistic human rights, through the paper, but I want to mention a little bit of it right now. I would like us to include, but not in our constitution, for reasons I won't go into now, that we exist to advance linguistic justice, language rights and language opportunities, and that we are brought to this position by our research, reflection and teaching, and that it is practice as well as theory that gets us to this point. Each of those propositions is elaborated in the written paper quite extensively. Linguistic justice implies that the jurisdictions in which we all live as citizens and also work as professionals are somehow or other lacking in justice. And I think that we can empirically demonstrate this. Where we teach, research, write language tests, devise curricula, train interpreters or language teachers, whether we support magistrates with forensic analysis of police investigations, we advise policymakers or early childhood educators, or whether we look at how culture is present in our Indonesian teaching, Japanese, Italian, French, modern Greek or Chinese programs. In all of these, there are questions of rights, justice and human opportunity, which I think go silent far too long. Advancing the idea for achieving the reality of linguistic justice needs to be done in an interdisciplinary way with economists, lawyers, policy experts, and others to advance the concepts of a linguistically grounded approach to human rights, but a way which is policy tractable. I mean, a very specific thing by policy tractability, something that's achievable in the real world. This claim must be operative. It's got to be future oriented, but it also should be reparative or restorative. In other words, it should it should mitigate injustice in the present, which is inherited from the past, but it should also repair injury and damage, which is the result of policies from the past. And it's incumbent on us to do this for three main reasons, and I'm going to talk about them in a few moments. This linguistic justice perspective does not preclude us doing other work. It does demand that everyone comply or do things only in this frame, but it's a really important characteristic of how we are present as a political community in the world. Organizationally, it builds discipline-specific theory for action to sustain a policy program for services and access for a wide range of linguistic human rights. Some of them will be language rights for First Nations peoples, which in Australia is an immensely important and urgent question for everybody to support in allyship with Indigenous people carrying the struggle for language revitalisation, for deaf Australians, recognition of Auslan, for immigrants, refugee and asylum claimants, for low literacy citizens, for the right for a comprehensive and language-rich education for all. interpreters and translators in health and legal settings. I won't read any more. They're all there for you to see. They're part of the work of many of our colleagues. In fact, I would say most of our colleagues do this. But what we don't have is a declaration that this is a purpose for the existence of our association. So what are the ways that we can legitimize this desire or claim on our organization? I've got three here. The first is the responsibility of intellectuals. The second is ethical practice. And the third is what I'm going to call epistemic legitimation. The first of these we can call Chomsky's demand. Now, in my written paper, there's an extended discussion of this. But just here, you can see that this is something that was published, an essay, in fact, by Noam Chomsky in the New York Review in 1967 on the 23rd of February. In fact, many of you are familiar with it. I believe a couple of years ago, a book was published reflecting on this, though I haven't read it. And he called it The Responsibility of Intellectuals. It's a context of urban protests against the bombing of North Vietnam by the United States, the massive nation-changing consequences of the Civil Rights Act, though in fact not going far enough because the whole field of critical race theory emerges out of some of the failures of the implementation of the Civil Rights Act, and largely by legally informed scholarship later. But this is the context within which Chomsky pens this. Now, he's recalling that as a 19-year-old undergraduate, 20 years prior to his writing of this back in 1947, he was deeply affected by the arguments of Dwight MacDonald, who basically proposed that intellectuals are positioned strategically and that this gives them an additional responsibility for the problems of the world. They can see more and see more deeply. And also, and here we get the real world question, they're a bit removed from the consequences of those things. Perhaps this is less true now than it used to be, but really, this is the logic here, that they're sufficiently strategically placed to see better and to therefore raise alarm. And of course, the logic of this is an ancient historical claim about truth and power, which I talk about at great length in the paper, but not in this presentation in the slides. Chomsky states, it's the responsibility of intellectuals to speak the truth and to expose lies. Then he thinks about it again and he says, this at least may seem enough of a truism to pass over without comment. Not so, however. And then he quotes Martin Heidegger, who said in a pro-Hitler declaration of 1933, truth is the revelation of that which makes a people certain, clear, and strong in its knowledge and action. So he's clearly declaring that this function of truth is not the same as his own at all. It is only this kind of truth that one has a responsibility to speak. This is still Heidegger. Chomsky states, intellectuals are in a position to expose the lies of government, to analyze their often hidden intentions. Intellectuals must use what he calls the privilege accorded by their occupational position and expertise. Privilege yields opportunity, and opportunities confer responsibilities. So you can see this is a kind of fusion of moral and political, almost dramatized argument in Chomsky's reasoning. I would love to say more about it. I'm constrained by time. I just want to point you to the section in my published article, in the article that will be published out of this, where some ways to understand and even critique Chomsky's position here are discussed. A second way into this is through the modern oath. Now, ALAA, the Applied Linguistic Association of Australia, we adhere to an oath of ethical professional practice. Most people say that we have ethics, codes of ethics and conduct for our work. If we haven't, we should. And if we don't have them in our professional associations, most of us work in universities that require us to have them. I published a few years ago in a book edited by Peter da Costa about the ethical quandaries of doing the kind of work that I do, which is professional language policy advising in conflict situations overseas, which is deeply unregulated in relation to its ethical practice, because it's overseas, because it's in difficult situations, and the governing contracts under which people work in these settings often are much less concerned with ethical practice than they are with just getting the deliverables in on time. The paradigm of ethical professional practice is the Horkos, the Hippocratic Oath. And there are some elements of this which you might think are really not relevant to what I'm arguing, but I'm going to mention them because I think they really are. We have to ask, why does anyone think an oath works? What is it about swearing an oath that would make someone more ethical or less ethical? I mean, if they were an unethical person, or they were inclined to cut corners in their research, would it compel them to be more ethical if you made them swear an oath? Well, in ancient Greece, the thinking of ancient Greece and Rome, the thinking around this was that physicians in particular, new doctors, novice doctors, could be made to be more ethical, to practice medicine honestly, if you put them in public and they swore before Apollo, the Olympian god, and the medicinal deities, the healer Asclepius, his daughter Hygieia, and Panacea, the goddess of remedy, the god remedy. And what this did was to require a kind of exposure of a publicly declared ethical mission, attaching external validation to an internal regulation. And they would have to say things like they would never do harm to anyone, and that they would only work, their motivation would be solely in the good of my patients. I can't assess how effective this might be. I'm sure it would be very effective in some cases, actually. I do believe that, and not in others. But in 1948, the World Medical Association looks at this business and says, actually, we should return to the oath and we should modify it. We should modernize it. There's no point in having Apollo involved anymore, so we'll make it secular. And there's not much point in doing it just around, when you read the actual ancient oath, there are some amusing and challenging in terms of contemporary values. So they decided to get rid of all of those things and do an oath which is more in keeping with what we know and think today. One of the things it says, this is the Declaration of Geneva, as it's called today: I will not permit considerations of race, disease, or disability, creed, ethnic origin, gender, nationality, political affiliation, race, sexual orientation, standing, social standing, or any other factor to intervene between my duty and my patient. Now, this arises because actually, whatever it was that doctors in certain regimes swore in the early part of the 20th century didn't work very well, because many medical professionals were engaged in grotesque violation of human rights, mass complicity with genocide under the Third Reich, but also the Japanese Imperial Army in China and other places, in mass eugenics programs, but not just in those countries, in the Americas and other places, working with disabled children and poor mothers in forms of violation of medical practice that I think anyone would find reprehensible today. Well, not anyone perhaps, but all of us. We all know about ethical regulation of academic life because we've filled in many dozens of forms that do this. But there's a history of these things, which is grand in the bad sense and grotesque as well. And the modern oath is there, therefore, for the conduct of our research. But I think it should be there for our associations and our public presence as well. So this links to Chomsky's demand that we have a responsibility as professionals for public engagement around wrongdoing, and then the modern oath for the professional conduct of our work. There is a third one, and I I want to give these through examples, and this is more extensively discussed in the paper, of course, as I said, than I can do here. And it's the conclusion of the book that Jan Blommaert edited in 1999 called Language Ideological Debates. And I couldn't find it because my office is in quarantine and I haven't been able to go there since March. I know exactly where it is on my desk. I couldn't get the quote online. So fortunately, through handheld devices, I was able to consult Jan, and he gave me the page number and other information. No, I got the page number eventually myself. But this is what it says at the end of his chapter, reflecting on the contributions in the book that look at ideological debates in many different countries in the world and different settings. Taking sides is unavoidable. It comes with a particular type of questioning of linguistic reality. An attempt at providing a history of language which takes into account social and political factors forces us to voice interpretations of these factors. And in social and political realities, interpretations are partisan, and they almost automatically align the one who formulated the interpretation with one or other political bloc. And then the clincher, so be it. Now, I asked him whether he would be willing to allow me to call this epistemic legitimation. And he said, yes, that's exactly what it is. And so this comes from the horse's mouth. So here, the positionality of intellectuals is discipline specific. This is about applied linguistics or sociology or historical writing and research. These are things that emerge from the knowledge, but it also links back to Chomsky's claim about intellectuals. But you can see how much more real-worldly grounded this construction is. Discipline-specific and action and public commitment come from specific stocks of knowledge gathered by scholars working with particular communities, especially disadvantaged and oppressed populations. This epistemic legitimation is dialectical and dialogical, unlike the Chomskyan Declaration of 1967. It's not unidirectional from scholar to research project, from scholar to the world. It's more dialectical, as I said. Now, I'm going to try and tie these premises so far, the definitions of applied linguistics that I've been using, the ways in which we legitimate, justify, defend, or are compelled by our social position, our professional training, the knowledge that we have to be in the world in a certain way, around the question of policy, which, as most of you know, is my gig, as they say. That's the stuff that I do. So whether in practice or political theory, just like in academic research and teaching, we encounter the dilemma of describing the world. We also encounter the desire and often the dilemma of wanting to intervene to change it. How could we not? This, for applied linguists, in common with other academics, wanting to apply knowledge we generate to social improvement raises the question of what kind of political community we are. What right do we have to claim that what we have generated as knowledge we can propose, propound, insist on, deliver, suggest? What claim can we make for the knowledge that we produce? These are deeply interesting and important questions. In my paper, I say that these are questions that we should discuss by reference to policy history. Policy is not available to us like Professor Minerva McGonagall's method for doing it, by transfiguration. In other words, she is outside the domains that she changes. She intervenes in them with her wand and brings about transfiguration. That's not available to applied linguists. We can't do this way. We have to engage with realities. And one of them is, and there's an extended section in my paper that I wanted to read, but I think Jonathan would cut me off if I were to do so. Basically, what we've got here is a history of the thinking of the relationship between power and knowledge. And I'm just going to advance well over Plato and Machiavelli and all of these people who made really important contributions to our thinking about this. Machiavelli is the inventor, I might just remind people, of the idea that advice is powerful. That he looks at the idea that that's bequeathed to him from the Platonic system of the republic governed by philosopher kings, this idealized anti-democratic practice. And he says, but a king can't know, or a prince can't know all of the things that he or she would need to know to govern well. So they must marshal around them knowledge experts, advisors, people whose stock in trade is to peddle and sell information and knowledge. Now just think of consultancy contracts in this context and you'll get some of where I'm going with this. Now, unfortunately, when you say in English the word Machiavelli, you just instantly get lots of people who think he's a really bad guy, but actually he's not. Well, he might have been a bad guy, but his work, both The Prince and the Discourses on Livy, are extremely important ways to understand society without regular recourse to the moralizing history from which preceded him and them. In the 1950s in New York, we've got a situation which is very relevant to this. We've got the Cold War raging, and the position of the United States as an immensely powerful global player. As Umberto Eco argued in a really wonderful paper once, it's the only transition in history between one imperial regime and another in which the same language was shared by the prior power and the subsequent power. And if you want to know in a simple word about the power of English today, surely it's in that transition. Harold Lasswell is thinking about how to secure the power of the United States, and in particular the United States system of government, because this is the Cold War period. And he starts to think of scientific attitudes in booming around the creation of space exploration and the great expansion of the American industrial economy at the time. And he develops the idea that policy can be scientific in quite exactly the same way that other fields of endeavor could be scientific. And I don't know if he uses the word perfect government, but people talk about his work as imagining that government could be perfected. Now, he develops the idea of the power of social science, of policy as science, technique, and the formalization of power. I developed this at some considerable length in the written paper. I just wanted to say here that one of the things that this does is to tame democracy, to tame and control and take the risk out of democracy. And for many decades after this, public policy schools were created all around the world in which the legacy of this thinking was deeply present. One of the devices that they created was the cost-benefit analysis, the options paper. These devices were ways of knowing better than ordinary citizens what should be done. It was a perfection of the discourse, the presence of talk of expert professionals in the field of decision-making, which, as you can imagine, in a system that lauds itself as democratic, is suggesting some of the Plato's technocracy already. And that is precisely how this gets critiqued over time. One of the things that they look at is how knowledge can be useful to power. Now remember, the Chomskyan critique was how knowledge could critique power or should critique power. Here we get this development of the idea in management and administration studies of ways in which to use knowledge, that is to get knowledge and use it, but not be shaped by it, not be influenced by it, just to use it for ends that are already established, for problems that are already named, for practices that are already set in train. And many studies have been done on this premise. And as you can see, I've just summarized some of these. They come from health services and things that facilitate the utilization of knowledge are personal contact between scientists and policymakers. What does that mean? It could mean lots of different things. All they say, rather mysteriously, is personal contact. Some very bad things have happened through personal contact between scientists and policymakers in history, but I won't go there now. Timeliness and relevance of research. Well, that's, I think, obviously true, but actually it cuts away many aspects of longer range research that looks deeply into presuppositions in life. But we'll leave that aside. Research that includes a summary with clear recommendations. Well, that's one I think we could all live with. Barriers to the utilization of research knowledge within policy are things like the absence of the context, so the mirror image of the first one, and the lack of timeliness. So you can see, I wonder how useful this kind of a way to understand things really is. This is the science of knowledge and utilization. Now I'm going to read some sections from my paper. I think I have time to do that around particularly this point on power and knowledge, because the slides only express some of it. And so this policy literacy that we get from Lasswell is based on the idea fundamentally of incrementalism, that we make micro changes to the way things exist in the world, and that these changes improve the experience and life of citizens incrementally. It's based on the utilitarianism of Jeremy Bentham. And on the basis of these incremental improvements, people become more attached to the society in which they live, and they functionally become more committed to the mode of decision-making which brought this about. In other words, that experts will make decisions on behalf of citizens because these experts know best. Now, you know, I'm working with an organization, I'm talking to an organization of people who are organized as experts. We are experts. So we have an issue here. This scientific revolution that Harold Lasswell wanted to bring about was to perfect the processes of government decision-making so there would be less and ultimately no contest against the decisions that governments would make, because they would be transparently the best decisions that could be made under those circumstances. Now, if we consider the government of the very country in which Harold Lasswell was working and some recent events there, we know that this was an ambition that was never realized. This takes us towards the idea of imagining decision-making as a form of technocracy. And in recent years, this has re-emerged because the critique against the Lasswellian vision was that it was actually perverting democracy rather than perfecting it, because it raised barriers to the participation of ordinary citizens, and because so much of what we want governments to do has really got nothing to do with the optimal decision that a system of government would make, but with our values, with our desires, with our sense of community, with what we would prefer substantively to be the case, rather than the technocratic temptation to tell us something else. So in recent years, there's been the re-emergence of something like the Lasswellian vision, only now it takes the name of episto or epistocracy. That is the belief that actually expert knowledge and expertise is underrepresented. Now, I think, like many of you, I strongly agree with a lot of that. I think that our experience in the last year has demonstrated the extraordinary importance of investment in expertise, utilization of expertise, and not just with COVID and the management of the pandemic, but also with a huge number of problems that applied linguists deal with all the time. The assessment of language for admission, acknowledgement of asylum, the determination of origin on the basis of language that public officials sometimes do, the consequences of data mining that happens through the algorithms that are produced by corporations that want to know on the basis of what our predictable future behaviors will be. So you see that the complexity of these problems is so great that actually it's given life to a movement within policy schools that had to abandon the Laswellian origins of the 50s under the critique, the very serious critique from principles. They're returning to some of these with new energy and returning to it with a claim that basically what's possible now is necessary. In other words, that the problems are too complex to trust ordinary citizens with the knowledge and the decision-making processes to do this. So we have a deep dilemma, which I think is never going to leave us. Language education and all the activities of applied linguistics are implicated in these processes. And it's important that we become policy literate so that we know what kind of interventions we can make. A political community, imagine the ALAA as a political community, makes a claim on public resources, on policy settings, and demands this on some basis. While a political community is not the same as a constituency group, because we would not aim to control votes, but voices. We would not be like a trade union or an employers' federation whose demands for action flow from the consequences of what their members do in that real world I was talking about before. Ours is a voice democracy, not a vote democracy claim. That is presence within conversations that understand that research is not the same as opinion, that research information and research findings are provisional, in fact. They're not ultimately acceptable truths all the time, but they're provisional in advancement on just opinion or just reflection that might be not informed very well. So we also need to be biddable within the community of conversation about politics. What do I mean by that? I mean that what our presence as a political community demands has to be able to deliver something. On one occasion, when I was present doing a facilitated dialogue, which I've been doing as part of the language and peace building work in Southeast Asia, and on this particular occasion in Myanmar, I was with someone working from an institution actually in Austria, in this particular individual's case, who was deeply taken by the idea that everything is conversational and we should just debate things and we should just, at whatever our audience wanted, would be the course of action that we would choose to follow. I'm deeply committed to much of this, but one of the things that I noted was that the audience were very uncomfortable. I think I'm being offered some water by Jonathan Crichton. Thank you very much, Jonathan, but you're in Adelaide. I do have water in Melbourne. So the audience were deeply uncomfortable with this process, and at one point asked this individual to share their expertise. That's why we asked you to be here. If it's just about talking, we can do that ourselves, one of the women in the audience said. Now, in great tribute to the particular individual, she was full of enormous expertise and modified her practice deeply to accommodate this. So I think in these situations, we learn something about the constant co-presence of debate and discussion and knowledge as a form of debate and discussion. Here we see on this slide that I'm saying that there is a binary formulation of knowledge versus power. And this has been deeply present in how policymakers have thought about the practice of policy. Classically, the role of officials is construed as administrators who have power but little knowledge, while experts have knowledge but little power. In the facilitated dialogue dynamics that I'm talking about, we probe how expertise is linked to power and how different kinds of knowledge and practices of language policy and planning are connected. Carol Barkey does studies of how problems are represented in policy, and she problematizes the assumption that's increasingly popular today that policy should or could be exclusively based on evidence. This would be the scientific principle of policy making, and that this evidence-based policy can stand apart from the desires of citizens, the interpretations that people make, or their preferences. So there's now a rich tradition of thinking about these kinds of things that actually makes us always understand that how we name problems is how we constitute policies. We must ask of policy, and this is us as a political community, whether it's criminal justice or health or immigration or language teaching, what's the problem represented to be in a specific policy? What presuppositions and assumptions underpin this representation of the problem? How has this problem come about in historical time? Whose interests are best served by posing the problem in this particular way? What is left unproblematic in this particular problem representation? In the written paper, I've got an extended section about the work of Murray Edelman and other people who look at problems as a spectacle. And I think language educators and applied linguists have always, implicitly anyway, been dealing with the problematization of the problem, which is what Barkey and others are getting to with this. So where are the silences? Can the problem be thought about differently, more productively perhaps? What effects are produced by the particular representation of the problem we're being given? Now, Australia had a really dramatic example of this in 1997. In a book that I published with Peter Freebody we called it Australian Literacies, we studied the literacy crisis of 1997. Many of you Australia-based people might not know that we suddenly became illiterate in 1997. And that was because the government decided that all the measures of literacy functioning in schools, which were basically on a continuum of practices that children used, abilities that they applied, this management of the semiotic resources they had available to them to make meaning, that we should actually insist that there should be a cutoff point. And at a particular cutoff point, we would say that people below it would be considered not literate or illiterate, and above it, literate. And so a lot of people who hadn't really been illiterate before then suddenly became so. This was a naming of the problem and a constitution of the problem that actually dictated how literacy policy functioned in Australia for the next 15 years. It was an act of language that did this. I don't know if I should promote another one of my writings, but I published an analysis of the only extended discussion in our parliament on Aboriginal linguistic human rights. And this started off as a claim from the member of the Northern Territory that the federal government at the time, in the late 1990s, was violating the linguistic human rights of Aboriginal people. And over a process of a long debate, the only one that's happened in our House of Representatives on that extended basis, this problem that was posed as a problem of the human rights of Aboriginal people to their languages ended up being, through the intervention of the Speaker and other members of Parliament who spoke in the course of it, a problem of the literacy of Aboriginal people and children, and therefore their inability, their deficit, and therefore their inability to proceed through schooling. This, what I'm putting to you now about naming problems and constituting policies, isn't some non-real world disquisition. It's in fact deeply connected to the real world consequences for many people. So we tend now to think of policy, or those of us who do this in policy schools, many people are not still wedded to this, as argument, winning arguments, prevailing in arguments. And as you can see, Gian Domenico Maione's work on this, which I think in a wonderful book in 1989, he talks about policy as really being real world policy, emotional, narrative-centered, interest-based, other non-technical elements, essentially politics plus value judgments and political interests, that it has less to do with formal techniques of problem solving than with the process of argument. So this kind of political community, that is an argumentative, ALAA, very polite, I'm sure, as Michelle and Jonathan would insist, but this political community would be deeply present through its engagement with policy. But this is nowhere near enough, as I'm going to argue. Because the problems, we can't wait for problems to be visited upon us, at least not in our areas. We can't influence huge quantities of the world, but we should want to influence those parts of the world that impact on us directly. And I think this is why I was saying before that we should promulgate our own claim to define the problems radically differently from how government might define them. We want to define them around the denial of linguistic human rights and language justice. Problem definition is part of agenda setting. This active engagement with agenda setting is what we must do. If we try to set the agenda, we can define the problems that might rise. And I use the word problem deliberately because some people say, well, we shouldn't talk about problems, talk about challenges. The problem is the word that in the fields and domains in which we want to work is deeply the way people organize their sense of what needs to be done in the world. And I think we cut ourselves off from those conversations if we don't go along with that. I'm going to give some examples of my work, then I'm going to close because I think I'm probably going to take too long here. Examples of the work I've done in recent years where this kind of policy analysis has been tried out on the ground, as it were. This individual, Professor Suwilai Premsrirat, is a colleague and friend. She's at Mahidol University, the Royal University in Bangkok, or just outside Bangkok, and she runs the Research Institute for Languages and Cultures of Asia. And she and I and others have got a work in progress on policy and conflict in Southeast Asia in multilingual settings. And she's been working in an area in the south of Thailand where there has been a lot of conflict between the dominant Buddhist Thai state and in those three provinces in the south, the Malay-speaking Muslim majority population, about 80%. And she was awarded the King Sejong Literacy Prize by UNESCO in 2016. And these were the remarks that she made at her acceptance. This is a Muslim community in a mainly Buddhist country, and they have their own Malay dialect. The fact that most don't speak Thai means they have done poorly in the Thai monolingual school system and have not always gone on to higher education. Very rarely have they actually gone on to higher education. As a result, they face problems finding work, which makes it easier for youth to be drawn into conflict. And this is indeed the case. Many thousands of people have been killed, including 200 school teachers. So this is an area of conflict in which language and language education are deeply, deeply present. And some of the work that Professor Suwilai has done in setting up bilingual programs, which massively increase the linguistic achievement of the Malay-speaking children in Thai, their literacy in Thai, their learning of English as well, and the development of their native Patani Malay and the learning of standard Malay through that process. These programs, only 6 of them, incredibly successful, yet the vast majority of the other schools systems are heavily assimilationist and allow practically no space for this. This is a really widespread problem in the world, and in Southeast Asia, it's deeply present and generates many conflicts. If you can see this well, this conflict has to do, you can see I've got the 4 languages involved, the 5 scripts, and I say in English at the top, there is a lot to do, then the same expression in Thai, in Malay, and in Arabic, which is a language that is taught in many of the schools. So Thai, Patani Malay, Bahasa Malaysia, English and Arabic are the languages. Rumi, Yawi and Thai are the 3 scripts. Rumi is Roman script language, which is used by Indonesian and Malay, of course, so the children must do both. So they've got a really complex, demanding linguistic pathway to flow through. And you would imagine, and in a situation like this, you would ask experts to help you. And in fact, Dr. Suwilay has done remarkable work in those schools and shown the benefits, which I'm going to just show you very, very quickly now. Oh, I think I don't have that slide. Here it is. These are the benefits of the programs that have been set up, published in a report by Kirk Person. The children who learn in Malay, in Patani Malay, learn Thai better and they learn it faster, despite the fact that they spend fewer hours in Thai medium classes. This is technical knowledge that's produced through really detailed monitoring of the children's performances in the South Thailand mother tongue-based multilingual education programs. They learn all other subjects better and they improve the scores, the ONET published scores, 6 ONET scores that the Thai Ministry of Education requires. So the Patani Malay mother tongue multilingual education students scored above the Deep South average in all areas under this program. If you're interested in my analysis of it, it's in this publication that I put out last year in the Handbook of Languages at War, because the refusal to acknowledge linguistic human rights in this case is I think one of the main causes of the conflict in the slow acting way that Dr. Suwilay has shown in her research, where children are tracked into unemployment and therefore vulnerable to recruitment by extreme radicals and therefore conflict, and in the more fast acting way of the hate speech that many of the residents here regularly hear from faraway politicians who control their lives, who won't accept them as a different form of Thai citizen. So these kinds of conflicts, as you can see here, there are 26 of them across Southeast Asia, and they raise all the same questions that I've been talking about, with the additional component of the outsider, which has been the role that I've played and tried to think about when I've been involved in them. So here we have a very specific instance of applied linguistics applied in applied linguistics problem areas, but with the additional element of deep conflict. Look, I just won't talk too much about this, but this has been the work that some of you know I've been doing in Myanmar as well, where we have worked through the application of applied linguistic principles. Even things like those of you who are ESL teachers, EAL teachers would know, one of the things, I've done this myself with students in my short teaching career in schools, collective writing and all of these processes which have been used in these facilitated dialogues to break away from the models of peace-building facilitated dialogues that the UN uses, which are mostly grounded in marriage guidance counseling for Western couples in America or something. You know, the kind of conflict mitigation methods that are available are hardly at all built on multicultural, multi-faith principles like they should be in places like this. And what they tend to give you is a set of manuals that you're supposed to use about how to mitigate conflict, which I think are deeply inappropriate. Anyway, the point of this is that we go through processes of decision-making about how people will think about policy for multilingualism, and the role of knowledge. And in policy for multilingualism, voice democracy is fundamentally important. And voice democracy means convincing people with rhetoric, facts, and new perspectives. It's a slow process. It involves talking for long periods of time. It involves multiple return visits. It involves establishing your own positionality as an outsider, but also an insider. So forms of being an ally, and occasionally having to lead when people ask you to do that, but mostly doing other kinds of support work. So these processes operate in these ways. Now, one of the things to connect it to the political community discussion here, and I want to link it to the early points I was making about politics, is that the expertise that we can claim and should claim and be proud of and apply, always understanding that it is provisional, because expertise through research is provisional, has power in and of itself. In discursive environments, the power of researched knowledge is something that is absolutely apparent in anyone who does these kinds of consultations. I want to move now, before I finish, to thinking about this in relation to Australia. I've published, as some of you know, an analysis of why we have the kinds of language policy that we have in Australia. And I think we can attribute it to the discursive presence of 4 groups of protagonists, or the balance of relationships between them. And I'll present the 4 first and then say how they shape up with each other. The first one are immigrant community organisations, which really were the motor of the Senate investigation into language policy in the early 80s, and that pushed the Hawke government to adopt the National Policy on Languages in 1987. And they have typically advanced the case for mother tongue maintenance, though often within a wider second language policy for all. And other aspects of their advocacy have been about parents enacting family language policies of bilingual parenting. The second protagonist group are Indigenous community organisations who focused attention on language rights, language revival, transitional and bilingual maintenance education, an enormous struggle that they have faced continually with governments chopping and changing direction, doing exactly the same kinds of things that I was describing in Southeast Asia, with unsympathetic governments and sometimes actively racist and hostile governments, dealing with questions of non-standard forms of the dominant language. And occasionally they've advocated constitutional recognition of their languages, but these have not actually prevailed in the recent iteration, say, of the Uluru Statement, which is the biggest claim on reconciliation politics at the moment. The third one, and by far the most powerful one, have been this group. And they have made a singular case for hitching languages to trade and to the exclusive construction of the national interest. In other words, that the national interest is to be understood as something that's determined by, in the rhetoric of and by, trade, diplomacy, and security elites. They claim priority over competing demands of policy, and they've often adopted the air of non-sectional advocacy. What do I mean by that? They position immigrants and Aborigines, but they're less worried about Aboriginal advocacy than immigrant advocacy, because most of that is in urban areas where they want the schools not to be concerned with immigrant languages, but with languages that they choose. The telling case on this is that when in 1994, the Council of Australian Governments adopted the Rudd Report, they have a clause in there that very few analysts have actually focused on. And it says that the 4 languages that were chosen should not be modified by anybody other than the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I rest my case. So I think there you can see a disenfranchisement of voices very deeply. They prevailed financially for a really long period of time, very large amounts of money. And yet with this particular protagonist group, if you look at their most recent statements, it's still about the language of crisis. So no matter how many dozens of millions of dollars have been invested into this way to understand the problem that they created, it hasn't produced the goods. So I think we do have more power in our ability to understand why certain things don't work. And then it's us. We are a protagonist in this. And usually we're present with language teacher associations, the learned academies, both in the humanities that I belong to, the Australian Academy of Humanities, or the sciences, social sciences, interpreters, translators, language academics, the Australian Linguistic Society, all of our colleagues and friends in all of these other associations, medical and legal personnel, etc. All of these groups. And the interesting question is, do we cohere as a political community? Do we cohere as a group that advocates? Are we biddable or are we dividable? And I think history shows that we've been deeply dividable, because governments, I could give you the vernacular version of what ministers say about dividability, but that's not appropriate here. So this language interest is mostly promoted universal second language study and wider language awareness. I think we should change. I think we should make our principal advocacy linguistic human rights and language justice. So, ALAA, prominent, active, strong at the interface of the academy and policy, as it has been. We work within and throughout for improvement. Some remarkable things were achieved in adult migrant education services with a government that's not particularly sympathetic to this field of work just this year by the leadership of people who are active in our own association. And we should welcome that. Very important things were achieved by literacy educators, but through another organisational setting. I think we can help to position and advocate for language justice guided by a commitment to language rights. And it would deal with some of these things much more. I think the process to do this would have to be elaborated, extensive and very deep. Deaf children and Auslan rights, Indigenous and immigrant language maintenance among children, public presence and use of languages. We need to foreground our multilingualism, not just celebrate it. Access to English and English literacy, reparative linguistic rights for First Nations Australians. These are just some, and I think that they should help constitute us as an active political community, demanding things of the society, but contributing to the solutions as well. Now, I told you about an uppercase, lowercase little trick here. You've probably picked it already. I think this is the political community that we should become. We are a small association run by volunteers and busy people. Everyone's busy, but no one's busier than people in ALAA. We managed to produce an excellent annual conference, an excellent journal, and our members have changed the country for the better in many ways over many years. All of that's utterly true. But what I'm proposing, therefore, is not that we change course, but that we go back to Davies and Brumfitt's definitions of applied linguistics, take them deeper to the heart, that we look at the sense of responsibility demanded in Chomsky's 1967 demands, responsibility declaration, even if we might dissent from some of it, and the separation between his professional academic life and the political person. That's all immaterial to this. The ethical position and the epistemic justification, our work to place linguistic human rights on the agenda of Australian public life. Some things are going to work in our way in the next period of time, because I think that the way in which Aboriginal languages are starting to be appreciated in public media, and Newsmore suggests that there is a consciousness of a new kind of civilizational compact that we could imagine. And we have to do this through the deepest documents of the society. The Uluru Statement from the Heart is obviously the most central one for a political reimagining of Australian reconciliation practice, but also deep and inhuman problems like refugee practices that past and current governments continually enact. And we must do all of this in a comprehensive way so that we're not ourselves making choices, but actually building on the epistemic legitimacy. The work that we do takes us to certain moral and public positions on the basis of knowledge. Because what we don't want ever is the government of kakistocracy. Now, I've actually got an extended section in my paper about kakistocracy. I like the word very much. It has a terrible and sordid history. It was in fact devised by aristocratic people in England and America to imagine a kind of government that would keep enslaved people, marginalized minorities, immigrants, women away from decision making. They said that if you included those categories of people, you would produce this kind of government, and that aristocratic rule should be what would prevail. We actually got democracy and our belief in democracy. The challenge to this comes from various kinds of technocratic inclination, people who want to overwhelm the desire of ordinary citizens to have governance reflect their wishes, their values, their priorities. But within this, knowledge, expertise has a particular place. It's constantly to be negotiated, and it constantly needs to be thought through. And this is what I'm suggesting that we can take forward, inspired by the work of great friends and individuals such as Christopher Candlin, whose lecture I've been very honoured to give today. I want to suggest that this is an agenda of our own work for the future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much from all of us, Joe, ALAA, friends and others. And I'll now hand over to Michelle, who'll round off for us today.
Thanks so much, Joe. As always, you've given us much food for thought, great provocations. And just to recap, really, you've reminded us that we stand in this association, but also in this field, on the shoulders of giants such as Chris. We do invite everyone to view this lecture, engage with the ideas, and then participate in a forum with us on the 23rd of November. Just a reminder about the time, it is 4:30 p.m. Melbourne time, or Australian Eastern Daylight Saving Time, just to confirm that. And we really look forward to seeing people and continuing this conversation, because I think it is very much an ongoing conversation and challenge for us into the future. So thank you once again.
Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.
Thank you.